This next section of the textbook talks about membrane permeability. That is, what substances can cross the membrane from the outside to the inside, as well as the inside to the outside. There are three choices in this permeability. Well, the membrane could be freely permeable. That means absolutely any substance can cross in any direction. The membrane could be selectively permeable, and that would be some substances can cross and others cannot. And the third would be impermeable, which is no substances can pass through the membrane whatsoever. So which do you think our cells are? Freely, selectively, or impermeable? They are selectively permeable. So this permeability is based on the solute size, whether it has a charge or not, its shape, and whether it dissolves in lipids. And that lipid solubility is important. Our membranes are lipid, and if a substance can dissolve in lipid, it can cross right through the membrane. So materials move in and out of the cell by different mechanisms, but they're basically divided into two groups of passive mechanisms, that is, no ATP is required, and active mechanisms, meaning ATP is required. So we'll talk about these different types of mechanisms. Passive mechanisms that do not require ATP include diffusion, and diffusion is movement by concentration differences. So on one side of the membrane, the solute is in very high concentration, that is, the substance, sugar or salt or hormone, it's in very high concentration, and it passes across the membrane to a low concentration. This is always passive. And there's also carrier-mediated transport, in which if it's passive, it's just basically a protein that produces a pore in the membrane and allows a substance to pass through that pore. Active mechanisms involve also carrier-mediated, that may be active, but also vesicular transport, and that is forming a vesicle, and that vesicle is going to transport the substance across the membrane. This picture is a picture of diffusion. In diffusion, substances, let's say this is Kool-Aid, and it's a hard cube of Kool-Aid, and it's in high concentration because it's a cube of Kool-Aid. And when you put it in water, those Kool-Aid molecules are going to diffuse or move passively from high concentration to low concentration, and eventually it will look the same throughout. Remember, the Kool-Aid is the solute, water here is the solvent, and the Kool-Aid mixture is a solution. Diffusion across the plasma membrane directly through the membrane can only occur for a few molecules. Lipids, lipid-soluble molecules, and gases can diffuse right across the membrane. But large and small molecules must have assistance, and that assistance is often a protein carrier. So here we see diffusion. If you're looking inside the cell, these gray dots represent carbon dioxide. There's a lot more CO2 in the cell than outside the cell because the cell is always producing CO2 in the mitochondria. And so this CO2 will always diffuse out of the cell because it's always higher concentration inside the cell. Osmosis is passive as well. Osmosis is just the flow of water, and water will flow across the membrane. So this water will flow from an area where there's more water to an area where there's less water. So inside the cell, there's proteins, there's carbohydrates, there's lipids, there's all kinds of substances. So therefore, there's water as well. Water is what is dissolving the substances in the cell. Well, in this diagram, there is more water inside the cell than outside the cell, and therefore water will flow outside the cell. And facilitated diffusion requires a carrier protein. Active processes also include carrier-mediated transport. An example would be the sodium-potassium pump. Sodium is constantly coming into the cell because our blood is about a 0.9% salt solution. So water will always flow, sodium, which is higher in the blood, tends to flow into the cells. Well, the cells do not like this, so they want to pump it out. And so there's an exchange here. The cells require more potassium, so they're pumping in potassium as they pump out the sodium. So our cells, with this sodium-potassium pump in 2 potassium for every 3 sodium they pump out. And this requires ATP. And then for vesicle formation, bringing a substance into the cell is called endocytosis. And here we see 3 different means of endocytosis. The first one is Pinocytosis. So think of a pina colada. You drink a pina colada, Pinot. Pinot is bringing in fluids. Phagocytosis is bringing in larger particles. And receptor-mediated endocytosis is bringing in specific molecules. For example, cholesterol. Cholesterol has receptors outside the cell, and they are going to grab the cholesterol in the blood and bring it into the cell. Exocytosis is the movement of any product out of the cell from a vesicle. And here are these processes that we've just talked about. Active transport, carrier-mediated active transport, and vesicle formation, active transport, pinocytosis, cell drinking, receptor-mediated cytosis, and phagocytosis. And endocytosis is the removal of substances from the cell. And you can see, as this vesicle is formed here in the cell, that the vesicle actually fuses with the membrane to release the substance. Which of the following does not move through the phospholipid bilayer of a cell's membrane? Glucose. Which of the following is associated with facilitated diffusion? Movement involves a carrier protein. Which of the following is a passive mechanism for moving solutes across a cell's plasma membrane? Passive means no ATP. And that would be diffusion. Osmosis is the movement of water only, not solutes. Which of the following processes will come to an immediate halt when an individual lacks ATP? Intake of potassium. ATP is required for the sodium-potassium pump. So the next section of the text is going to talk about tissues, and it's a long section. Remember the hierarchy, the level of organization of the body, from chemicals to organelles to cells to tissues. Cells combine to form tissues. So tissues consist of similar cells that perform the same function. Tissues combine to form organs. The heart is an organ. And organs combine to form organ systems. The cardiovascular system is an organ system. So at the tissue level, there are 4 types of tissue, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to remember this slide, this part down here, with the very brief explanations for each type of tissue. We'll get into more detail, but this will get you pretty far if you know all of this. So epithelial tissues cover surfaces, they line passageways and chambers, and they produce secretions. Connective tissues fill internal spaces, provide structural support, and store energy. Muscles contract to produce movement, and neural tissue conducts electrical impulses of information. Histology is the study of tissues, and again, there are 4 primary tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and neural.